Volume-1, Chapter-13. As Venice shepherd of the Hebridean Isles, placed for amid the melancholy main, whether it be lone fancy him beguiles, or that aerial being sometimes deigned to stand embodied to our senses plain, sees on the naked hill or valley low the wilds in ocean Phoebus dips his wine, a vast assembly moving to and fro, then all at once in air dissolves the wondrous show. Castle of Indolence, Madame Sharon's avarice at length yielded to her vanity. Some very splendid entertainments which Madame Clerval had given, and the general adulation which was paid her, made the former more anxious than before to secure an alliance that would so much exalt her in her own opinion and in that of the world. She proposed terms for the immediate marriage of her niece, and offered to give Emily a dower, provided Madame Clerval observed equal terms on the part of her nephew. Madame Clerval listened to the proposal, and considering that Emily was the apparent heiress of her aunt's wealth, accepted it. Meanwhile Emily knew nothing of the transaction, till Madame Sharon informed her that she must take preparation for the nuptials, which would be celebrated without further delay. Then, astonished and wholly unable to account for this sudden conclusion which Valancourt had not solicited, for he was ignorant of what had passed between the elder ladies, and had not dared to hope such good fortune, she decisively objected to it. Madame Sharon, however, quite as zealous of contradiction now, as she had been formerly contended for a speedy marriage, with as much vehemence as she had formerly opposed whatever had the most remote possibility of leading to it, and Emily's scruples disappeared when she again saw Valancourt, who was now informed of the happiness designed for him, and came to claim a promise of it from herself. While preparation was making for this nuptials, Montoni became the acknowledged lover for Madame Sharon, and though Madame Clerval was much displeased when she heard of the approaching connection, and was willing to prevent that of Valancourt with Emily, her conscience told her that she had no right thus to trifle with their peace, and Madame Clerval, though a woman of fashion, was far less advanced than her friend in the art of deriving satisfaction from distinction and admiration rather than from conscience. Emily observed with concern the ascendancy which Montoni has acquired over Madame Sharon, as well as the increasing frequency of his visits, and her own opinion of his Italian, and confirmed by that of Valancourt, who had always expressed a dislike of him. As she was one morning sitting at work in the pavilion, enjoying the pleasant freshness of spring, whose colours were now spread upon the landscape, and listening to Valancourt, who was reading, but who often laid aside the book to converse, she received a summons to attend Madame Sharon immediately, and had scarcely entered the dressing-room when she observed with surprise the dejection of her aunt's countenance, and the contrasted gaiety of her dress. "So, miss," said Madame, and she stopped under some degree of embarrassment. "I sent for you. I wished to see you. I have news to tell you. From this hour you must consider the Signor Montoni as your uncle. We were married this morning." Astonished, not so much at the marriage as at the secrecy with which it had been concluded, and the agitation with which it was announced, Emily at length attributed the privacy to the wish of Montoni rather than of her aunt. His wife, however, intended that the contrary should be believed, and therefore added, "You see, I wished to avoid a bustle, but now the ceremony is over I shall do so no longer, and I wish to announce to my servants that they must receive the Signor Montoni for their master." Emily made a feeble attempt to congratulate her on these apparently imprudent nuptials. "I shall now celebrate my marriage with some splendour," continued Madame Montoni, "and to save time I shall avail myself for the preparation that has been made for yours, which will of course be delayed a little while. Such of your wedding clothes as already I shall expect you will appear in, to do honour to this festival. I also wish you to inform Monsieur Valancourt that I have changed my name, and he will acquaint Madame Clerval in a few days. I shall give a grand entertainment at which I shall request their presence." Emily was so lost in surprise and various thought that she made Madame Montoni scarcely any reply, but at her desires returned to inform Valancourt of what had passed. Surprise was not his predominant emotion on hearing of these hasty nuptials, and when he learned that they were to be the means of delaying his own, and that the very ornaments of the chateau which had been prepared to grace the nuptial day of his Emily were to be degraded to the celebration of Madame Montoni's, grief and indignation agitated him alternately. He could conceal neither from the observation of Emily, whose efforts to abstract him from these serious emotions, and to laugh at the apprehensive considerations that assailed him, were ineffectual. And when at length he took leave, there was an earnest tenderness in his manner that extremely affected her. She even shed tears when he disappeared at the end of the terrace, yet knew not exactly why she should do so. Montoni now took possession of the chateau and the command of his inhabitants with the ease of a man who had long considered it to be his own. His friend Chavigny, who had been extremely serviceable in having paid Madame Cheron the attention and flattery which she required, but from which Montoni too often revolted, had apartments assigned to him, and received from the domestics an equal degree of obedience with the master of the mansion. Within a few days, Madame Montoni, as she had promised, gave a magnificent entertainment to a very numerous company, among whom was Valancourt, but at which Madame Clerval accused herself from attending. There was a concert ball and supper. Valancourt was of course Emily's partner, and though when he gave a look at the decorations of the apartment, he couldn't but remember that they were designed for other festivities than those they now contributed to celebrate, he endeavoured to check his concern by considering that a little while only would elapse before they would be given to their original destination. During this evening, Madame Montoni danced, laughed, and talked incessantly, while Montoni, silent, reserved, and somewhat haughty, seemed weary of the parade and of the frivolous company it had drawn together. This was the first and the last entertainment given in celebration of the nuptials. Montoni, though the severity of his temper and the gloominess of his pride prevented him from enjoying such festivities, was extremely willing to promote them. It was seldom that he could meet in any company a man of more address, and still seldomer one of more understanding than himself. The balance of advantage in such parties, or in the connections which might arise from them, must therefore be on his side, and knowing that, as he did, the selfish purposes of which they are generally frequented, he had no objection to measure his talents of dissimulation with those of any other competitor for distinction and plunder. But his wife, who, when her own interest was immediately concerned, had sometimes more discernment than vanity, acquired a consciousness of her inferiority to other women in personal attraction, which, uniting with the jealousy nature to the discovery, counteracted his readiness of mingling with all the parties Thoughtless could afford, till she had, as she supposed, the affections of her husband to lose. She had no motive for discovering the unwelcome truth, and it had never obtruded itself upon her, but now that it influenced her policy, she opposed her husband's inclination for company with the more eagerness, because she believed him to be really as well received in the female society of the place, as during his address to her he had affected to be. A few weeks only had elapsed since the marriage, when Madame Montoni informed Emily that the Signor intended to return to Italy as soon as the necessary preparation could be made for so long a journey. "We shall go to Venice," said she, "where the Signor has a fine mansion, and from thence to his estate in Tuscany. "Why do you look so grave, child? You, who are so fond of a romantic country and fine views, will doubtless be delighted with this journey." "Am I then to be of the party, madam?" said Emily, with extreme surprise and emotion. "Most certainly," replied her aunt. "How could you imagine we should leave you behind?" "Be I, but I see you are thinking of the Chevalier. He is not yet, I believe, informed of the journey, but he very soon will be so." Signor Montoni is gone to acquaint Madame Clerval of her journey, and to say that the proposed connection between the families must from this time be thought of no more. The unfeeling manner in which Madame Montoni thus informed her niece that she must be separated, perhaps for ever, from the man with whom she was on the point of being united for life, added to the dismay which she must otherwise have suffered at such intelligence. When she could speak, she asked the cause of the sudden change in Madame's sentiments towards Valancourt, but the only reply she could obtain was that the Signor had forbade the connection, considering it to be greatly inferior to what Emily might reasonably expect. "I now leave the affair entirely to the Signor," added Madame Montoni, "but I must say that M. Valancourt never was a favourite with me, and I was over-persuaded, or I shouldn't have given my consent to the connection. I was weak enough. I am so foolish sometimes to suffer other people's uneasiness to affect me, and so my better judgment yielded to your affliction. But the Signor has very properly pointed out the folly of this, and he shall not have to reprove me a second time. I am determined that you shall submit to those who know how to guide you better than yourself. I am determined that you shall be comfortable." Emily would have been astonished at the assertions of this eloquent speech, had not her mind been so overwhelmed by the sudden shock it had received, that she scarcely heard a word of what was latterly addressed to her. Whatever were the weakness of Madame Montoni, she might have avoided to accuse herself with those of compassion and tenderness to the feelings of others, and especially to those of Emily. It was the same ambition that lately prevailed upon her to solicit an alliance with Madame Clerval's family, which induced her to withdraw from it, now that her marriage with Montoni had exalted her self-consequence, and with it her views for her niece. Emily was at this time too much affected to employ either remonstrance or entreaty on this topic, and when at length she attempted the latter, her emotion overcame her speech, and she retired to her apartment to think, if in the present state of her mind to think was possible upon the sudden and overwhelming subject. It was very long before her spirits were sufficiently composed to permit the reflection, which, when it came, was dark and even terrible. She saw that Montoni sought to aggrandise himself in his disposal of her, and it occurred that his friend Chavigny was the person for whom he was interested. The prospect of going to Italy was still rendered darker when she considered the tumultuous situation of that country, then torn by civil commotion, where every petty state was at war with its neighbour, and even every castle liable to the attack of an invader. She considered the person to whose immediate guidance she would be committed, and the vast distance that was to separate her from Valancourt, and at the recollection of him every other image vanished from her mind, and every thought was again obscured by grief. In this perturbed state she passed some hours, and when she was summoned to dinner, she entreated permission to remain in her own apartment, but Madame Montoni was alone, and the request was refused. Emily and her aunt said little during the repast, the one occupied by her griefs, the other engrossed by the disappointment which the unexpected absence of Montoni occasioned, for not only as her vanity piqued by the neglect, but her jealousy alarmed by what she considered as a mysterious engagement. When the cloth was drawn and they were alone, Emily renewed the mention of Valancourt, but her aunt neither sharpened to pity nor ever came to remorse, become enraged that her will should be opposed, and the authority of Montoni questioned. Though this was done by Emily with her usual gentleness, who after a long and torturing conversation retired in tears. As she crossed the hall, a person entered it by the great door, whom, as her eyes hastily glanced that way, she imagined to be Montoni, and she was passing on with quicker steps when she heard the well-known voice of Valancourt. "Emily, oh my Emily!" cried he, in a tone faltering with impatience, while she turned and he advanced, was alarmed at the expression of his countenance and the eager desperation of his air. "In tears, Emily, I could speak with you," said he. "I have so much to say. Conduct me to where we may converse. But you tremble, you are ill. Let me lead you to a seat." He observed the open door of an apartment and hastily took her and led her thither, but she attempted to withdraw it and said with a languid smile, "I am better already. If you wish to see my aunt, she is in the dining parlour." "I must speak with you, my Emily," replied Valancourt. "Good God! It is already come to this. Are you indeed willing to resign me? But this is an improper place. I am overheard. Let me entreat your attention, if only for a few minutes, when you have seen my aunt," said Emily. "I was wretched enough when I came hither," explained Valancourt. "Do not increase my misery by this coldness, this cruel refusal." The despondency with which he spoke this affected her almost to tears, but she persisted in refusing to hear him till he had conversed with Madame Montoni. "Where is her husband?" "Where, then, in Montoni?" said Valancourt in an altered tone. "It is he to whom I must speak." Emily, terrified for the consequence of the indignation that flashed in his eyes, tremblingly assured him and Montoni was not at home, and entreated he would endeavour to moderate his resentment. At the tremulous accents of her voice, his eyes softened instantly from wildness to tenderness. "You are ill, Emily. They will destroy us both. Forgive me that I dare to doubt your affection," said he. Emily no longer opposed him. As he led her into an adjoining parlour, the manner in which he had named Montoni had so much alarmed her for his own safety, that she was now only anxious to prevent the consequences of his just resentment. He listened to her entreaties with attention, but replied to them only with looks of despondency and tenderness, concealing as much as possible the sentiments he felt towards Montoni, that he might soothe the apprehensions which distressed her. But she saw the veil he had spread over his resentment and his assumed tranquillity, only alarming her more. She urged at length the impolicy of forcing an interview with Montoni, and of taking any measure which might render their separation. Valancourt yielded to this remonstrance, and her affectionate entreaties drew from him a promise that however Montoni might persist in his design of disuniting them, he would not seek to redress his wrongs by violence. "For my sake," said Emily, "let the consideration of what I should suffer deter you from such a mode of revenge." "For your sake, Emily," replied Valancourt, his eyes filling with tears of tenderness and grief, which he gazed upon her. "Yes, yes, I shall subdue myself. But though I had given you my solemn promise to do this, do not expect that I can tamely submit to the authority of Montoni. If I could, I should be unworthy of you. Yet, oh Emily, how long may we condemn me to live without you? How long may it be before you return to France?" Emily endeavoured to soothe him with assurance of her unaltered affection, and by representing that in little more than a year she should be her own mistress as far as related to her aunt. From those guardianship her age would then release her, as those whose dominion over her would not cease with their rights, but he affected to be consoled by them. Emily, confronted by the promise she had obtained and by his apparent composure, was about to leave him when her aunt entered the room. She threw a glance of sharp reproof upon her niece, who immediately withdrew, and of haughty displeasure upon Valancourt. "This is not the conduct I should have expected from you, sir," said she. "I didn't expect to see you in my house, after you had been informed that your visits were no longer agreeable, much less that you should seek a clandestine interview with my niece, and that she would grant one." Valancourt, perceiving it necessary to vindicate Emily from such a design, explained that the purpose of his own visit had been to request an interview with Montoni, and he then entered upon the subject of it with the tempered spirit which the sex rather than the respectability of Madame Montoni demanded. The feeling eloquence of Valancourt, however, at length made her sensible in some measure of her unworthy conduct, and she became susceptible to shame, but not remorse. She hated Valancourt, who awakened her to this painful sensation, and in proportion as she grew dissatisfied with himself, her abhorrence of him increased. This was also the more inveterate because his tempered words and manner were such as, without accusing her, compelled her to accuse herself, and neither left her a hope that the odious portrait was the caricature of his prejudice, or afforded her an excuse for expressing the violent resentment with which she contemplated it. At length her anger rose to such a height that Valancourt was compelled to leave the house abruptly, lest he should forfeit his own esteem by an intemperate reply. He was then convinced that the Madame Montoni he had nothing to hope for. What was either pity or justice could be expected from a person who could feel the pain of guilt without the humility of repentance? To Montoni he looked with equal despondency, since it was nearly evident that the plan of separation originated with him, and it was not probable that he would relinquish his own views to entreaties or remonstrances, which he must have foreseen and have been prepared to resist. Yet, remembering his promise to Emily, and more solicitous concerning his love than jealous of his consequence, Valancourt was careful to do nothing that might unnecessarily irritate Montoni. He wrote to him, therefore, not to demand an interview, but to solicit one, and having done this, he endeavoured to wait with calmness his reply. Madame Clerval was passive in the affair. When she gave her approbation to Valancourt's marriage, it was in the belief that Emily would be the heiress of Madame Montoni's fortune, and though upon the nuptials of the latter, when she perceived the fallacy of this expectation, her conscience had withheld her with adopting any measure to prevent the union. Her benevolence was not sufficiently active to impel her towards any step that might now promote it. She was, on the contrary, secretly pleased that Valancourt was released from an engagement which she considered to be as inferior in point of fortune to his merit as his alliance was thought by Montoni to be humiliating to the beauty of Emily, and though her pride was wounded by this rejection of a member of her family, she disdained to show resentment otherwise than by silence. Montoni, in his reply to Valancourt, says that as an interview could neither remove the objection of the one nor overcome the wishes of the other, It would serve only to produce useless altercation between them. He therefore thought proper to refuse it. In consideration of the policy suggested by Emily and of his promise to her, Valancourt restrained the impulse that urged him to the house of Montoni to demand that what had been denied to his entreaties. He only repeated his solicitations to see him, seconding them with all the arguments his situation could suggest. Thus several days passed in remonstrance on one side and inflexible denial on the other, for whether it was fear, shame, or the hatred which results from both that made Montoni shun the man he had injured, he was peremptory in his refusal, and was neither softened to pity by the agony which Valancourt's letters portrayed, nor awakening to a repentance of his own injustice by the strong remonstrance he employed. At length Valancourt's letters were returned unopened, and then in the first moments of the passionate despair he forgot every promise to Emily, except the solemn one which bound him to avoid violence, and hastened to Montoni's chateau, determined to see him by whatever other means might be necessary. Montoni was denied, and Valancourt, when he afterwards inquired for Madame and Mademoiselle St. Aubert, was absolutely refused admittance by the servants. Not choosing to submit himself to a contest with this, he at length departed, and returning home in a state of mind approaching to frenzy, wrote to Emily of what had passed, expressed without restraint all the agony of his heart, and entreated that, since he must not otherwise hope to see her immediately, she would allow him an interview unknown to Montoni. Soon after he had dispatched this, his passions becoming more temperate, he was sensible of the error he had committed in having given Emily a new subject of distress in the strong mention of his own suffering, and would have given half the world had it been his to recover the latter. Montoni, meanwhile, every day more impatient to leave France, gave repeated orders for dispatch to the servants employed in preparation for the journey, and to the person with whom he was transacting some particular business. He preserved a steady silence to the letters in which Valancourt, despairing of greater good, and having subdued the passion that had transgressed against his policy, solicited only the indulgence of being allowed to bid Emily farewell. But when Valancourt learned that she was really to set out in a very few days, and that it was designed he would see her no more, forgetting every consideration of prudence, he dared in a second letter to Emily to propose a clandestine marriage. This also was transmitted to Madame Montoni, and the last lady of Emily's stay at Thoulouse arrived without affording Valancourt even a line to soothe his sufferings, or a hope that he should be allowed a parting interview. During this period of torturing suspense to Valancourt, Emily was sunk into that kind of stupor with which sudden and irremediable misfortune sometimes overwhelms the mind. Loving him with the tenderest affection, and having long been accustomed to consider him as a friend and companion to all her future days, she had no ideas of happiness that were not connected with him. What then must have been her suffering, when thus suddenly they were to be separated, perhaps for ever, certainly to be thrown into a distant part of the world, where they could scarcely hear of each other's existence, and all this in obedience to the will of a stranger, for such a Montoni, and of a person who had but lately been anxious to hasten their nuptials. It was in vain that she endeavoured to subdue her grief, and resign herself to an event which she could not avoid. The silence of Valancourt afflicted more than it surprised her, since she attributed it to its just occasion, but when the day preceding that on which she was to quit Thoulouse arrived, and she had heard no mention of his being permitted to take leave of her, grief overcame every consideration that had made her reluctant to speak of him, and she inquired of Madame Montaigne whether this consolation had been refused. Her aunt informed her that it had, adding that after the provocation she had herself received from Valancourt in their last interview, and the persecution which the Signor had suffered from his letters, if the Chevalier expected this favour from us, he should have conducted himself in a very different manner. He should have waited patiently till he knew whether we were disposed to grant it, and not have come and reproved me because I didn't think proper to bestow my niece upon him, and then have persisted in troubling the Signor because he didn't think proper to enter into any dispute about so childish an affair. His behaviour throughout has been extremely presumptuous and impertinent, and I desire that I may never hear his name repeated, and that you will get the better of those foolish sorrows and whims, and look like other people, and not appear with that dismal countenance, as if you were ready to cry, for though you say nothing, you cannot conceal your grief from my penetration. I can see you are ready to cry at this moment, though I am reproving you for it, even now, in spite of my comments. Emily, having turned away to hide her tears, quitted the room to indulge them, and the day was passed in an intensity of anguish such as, she said, perhaps never known before. When she withdrew to her chamber for the night, she remained in the chair where she had placed herself on entering the room, absorbed in her grief, till long after every member of the family except her was retired to rest. She couldn't divest herself for a belief that she had parted with the Valancourt to meet no more, a belief which didn't arise merely from forcing circumstances, for though the length of the journey she was about to commence, the uncertainty as to the period of her return, together with the prohibitions she had received, seemed to justify it. She yielded also to an impression which she mistook for an presentiment that she was going from Valancourt, for even how dreadful to her imagination too was the distance that would separate them. The Alps, those tremendous barriers, would rise, and whole countries extend between the regions where each must exist. To live in adjoining provinces, to live even in the same country, though without seeing him, was comparative happiness to the conviction of this dreadful length of distance. Her mind was at length so much agitated by the consideration of her state and the belief that she had been seen Valancourt for the last time, that she suddenly became very faint, and looking around the chamber for something that might revive her, she observed the casements, and had just strained to throw one open, near which she seated herself. The air recalled her spirits, and the still moonlight that fell upon the elms of a long avenue fronting the window somewhat soothed them, and determined her to try whether exercise and the open air would not relieve the intense pain that bound her temples. In the chateau all was still, and passing down the great staircase into the hall, from whence a passage led immediately to the gardens, softly and unheard, as she thought, unlocked the door and entered the avenue. Emily passed on with steps now hurried and now faltering, as deceived by the shadows among the trees. She fancied she saw some person move in the distant perspective, and feared that it was a spy of Madame Montoni. Her desire, however, to revisit the pavilion where she had passed so many happy hours with Valancourt, and had admired with him the extensive prospect over Languedoc and her native Gascony, overcame her apprehension of being observed, and she moved on towards the terrace, while running along the upper garden commanded the whole of the lower one, and communicated with it by a flight of marble steps that terminated the avenue. Having reached these steps, she paused a moment to look around, for her distance from the chateau now increased the fear which the stillness and obscurity of the hour had awakened, but perceiving nothing that could justify it, she ascended to the terrace, where the moonlight showed the long broad walk, with the pavilion at its extremity, while the rays silvered the foliage of the high trees and shrubs that bordered it on the right, and the tufted summits of those that rose to a level with the balustrade on the left. From the garden below, her distance from the chateau again alarming her, she paused to listen. The night was so calm that no sound could have escaped her, but she heard only the plaintive sweetness of the nightingale with the light shiver of the leaves, and she pursued her way towards the pavilion, having reached which its obscurity did not prevent the emotion that a fuller view of its well-known scene would have excited. The lattices were thrown back, and showed beyond their embowed arch the moonlight landscape, shadowy and soft, its groves and plains extending gradually and indistinctly to the eye, its distant mountains catching a stronger gleam, and the nearer river reflecting the moon and trembling to her rays. Emily, as she approached the lattice, was sensible of the features of this scene only as they served to bring Valancourt more immediately to her fancy. "Ah," said she, with a heavy sigh, as she threw herself into a chair by the window, "how often have we sat together in this spot, often have looked upon that landscape! Never, never more shall we view it together, never, never more, perhaps, shall we look upon each other." Her tears were suddenly stopped by terror. A voice spoke near her in the pavilion. She shrieked. It spoke again, and she distinguished the well-known tones of Valancourt. It was indeed Valancourt who supported her in her arms. For some moments their emotion wouldn't suffer either to speak. "Emily," said Valancourt, as he pressed her hand in his. "Emily," and he was again silent, but the accent in which he had pronounced her name expressed all his tenderness and sorrow. "Oh, my Emily," he resumed after a long pause, "I do then see you once again, and hear again the sound of that voice. I have haunted this place, these gardens, for many, many nights, with a faint, very faint hope of seeing you. This was the only chance that remained to me, and thank heaven it was at length succeeded. I am not condemned to absolute despair." Emily said something she scarcely knew what, expressive of her unalterable affection, and endeavoured to calm the agitation of his mind, but Valancourt could for some time only utter incoherent expressions of his emotion, and when he was somewhat more composed, he said, "I came hither soon after sunset, and have been watching in the gardens and in this pavilion ever since, for though I had now given up all hope of seeing you, I couldn't resolve to tear myself from a place so near to you, and should probably have lingered about the chateau till morning dawn. Oh, how heavily the moments have passed, yet with what various emotion have they been marked! As I sometimes thought I heard footsteps, and fancied you were approaching, and then again perceived only a dead and dreary silence. But when you opened the door of the pavilion and the darkness prevented my distinguishing with certainty whether it was my love, my heart beat so strongly with hopes and fears that I could not speak. The instant I heard the plaintive accents of your voice, my doubts vanished, but not my fears. Till you spoke to me, then losing of apprehension of alarming you in the excess of my emotion, I could no longer be silent. Oh, Emily, these are moments in which joy and grief struggle so powerfully for preeminence that the heart can scarcely support the contest. Emily's heart acknowledged the truth of his assertion, but the joy she felt on thus meeting Valancourt at the very moment when she was lamenting that they must probably meet no more, soon melted into grief. As reflection stole over her thoughts and imagination prompted visions of the future, she struggled to recover the calm dignity of mind which was necessary to support her through this last interview, and which Valancourt found it utterly impossible to attain, for the transports of his joy changed abruptly into those of suffering, and he expressed in the most impassioned language his horror of his separation and his despair of their ever meeting again. Emily wept silently as she listened to him, and then, trying to command her own distress and to soothe his, she suggested every circumstance that could lead to hope, but the energy of his fears led him instantly to detect the friendly flourishes which they endeavoured to impose on herself on him, and also to conjure up illusions too powerful for his reason. "You are going from me," said he, "to a distant country. Oh, how distant! To new society, new friends, new admirers, with people too, who will try to make you forget me and to promote new connections. How can I know this, and not know that you will never return to me, never can be mine?" His voice was stifled by sighs. "You believe, then," said Emily, "that the pangs of I suffered proceed from a trivial and temporary interest. You believe—" "Suffer?" interrupted Valancourt. "Suffer for me? Oh, Emily, how sweet, how bitter are those words! What comfort, what anguish do they give! I ought not to doubt the steadiness of your affection, yet such is the inconstancy of real love, that it is always awake to suspicion, however unreasonable, while always requiring new assurances from the object of its interest, and thus it is that I always feel revived as by a new conviction. When your words tell me I am dear to you, and wanting these, I relapse into doubt, and too often into despondency." Then, seeming to recollect himself, he explained, "But what a wretch I am, thus to torture you, and in these moments too, I, who ought to support and comfort you." This reflection overcame Valancourt with tenderness, but relapsing into despondency, he again felt only for himself, and lamented again this cruel separation in a voice and words so impassioned that Emily could no longer struggle to repress her own grief, or to soothe his. Valancourt, between these emotions of love and pity, lost the power and almost the wish of repressing his agitation, and in the intervals of convulsive sobs, he at one moment kissed away her tears, then told her cruelly that possibly she might never again weep for him, and then tried to speak more calmly, but not only exclaimed, "Oh, Emily, my heart will break. I cannot leave you. Now I gaze upon the countenance, now I hold you in my arms a little while, and all this will appear a dream. I shall look and cannot see you, shall try to recollect your features, and the impression will be fled from my imagination to hear the tones of your voice, and even memory will be silent. I cannot cannot leave you. Why should we confine the happiness of our whole lives to the will of people who have no right to interrupt and except in giving you to me, have no power to promote it? Oh, Emily, venture to trust your own heart, venture to be mine forever. His voice trembled, and he was silent. Emily continued to weep, and was silent also, when Valancourt proceeded to propose an immediate marriage, and that an early hour on the following morning she should quit Madame Montoni's house, and be conducted by him to the church of Augustines, where a friar should await to unite them. The silence with which she listened to a proposal, dictated by love and despair, and enforced at a moment when it seemed scarcely possible for her to oppose it, when her heart was softened by the sorrows of separation that might be eternal, and her reason obscured by the illusion of love and terror, encouraged him to hope that it would not reject it. "Speak, my Emily," said Valancourt eagerly. "Let me hear your voice, let me hear you confirm my fate." She spoke not. Her cheek was cold, and her senses seemed to fail her, but she didn't faint. To Valancourt's terrified imagination she appeared to be dying. He called upon her name, rose to go to the chateau for assistance, and then, recollecting her situation, feared to go or to leave her for a moment. After a few minutes she drew a deep sigh, and began to revive. The conflict she had suffered between the love and the duty she has at present owed to her father's sister, her repugnance to a clandestine marriage, her fear of emerging on the world with embarrassments such as might ultimately involve the object of her affection in misery and repentance. Valancourt in obscurity and vain regret, which she saw or thought she saw, must be the too certain consequence of a marriage in their present circumstances, and she acted perhaps with somewhat more than female fortitude when she resolved to endure the present rather than provoke a distant misfortune, with a candour that proved how truly she esteemed and loved him, and which endeared her to him, if possible, more than ever. She told Valancourt all her reasons for rejecting his proposals, those which influenced her concerning his future welfare. He instantly refuted, or rather contradicted, but they awakened tender considerations for her, which the frenzy of passion and despair had concealed before, and love, which had but lately prompted him to propose a clandestine and immediate marriage, now induced him to renounce it. The triumph was almost too much for his heart. For Emily's sake he endeavoured to stifle his grief, but the swelling anguish would not be restrained. "Oh, Emily, I must leave you. I must leave you, and I know it is forever." Convulsive sobs again interrupted in his words, and they wept together in silence, till Emily, recollecting the danger of being discovered and impropriety of prolonging an interview which might subject her to censure, summoned all her fortitude to utter at least last farewell. "Stay," said Valancourt, "I conjure you stay, for I have much to tell you. The agitation of my mind has hitherto suffered me to speak only on the subject that occupied it. I have forborne to mention a doubt of much importance, partly lest it should appear as if I told it with an ungenerous view of alarming you into a compliance with my late proposal." Emily, much agitated, did not leave Valancourt, but she led him from the pavilion, and, as they walked upon the terrace, he proceeded as follows: "This Montoni, I have heard some strange hints concerning him, as if certain he is of Madame Fancel's family, and that his fortune is what it appears to be." "I have no reason to doubt either," replied Emily in a voice of alarm. "Of the first, indeed, I cannot doubt, but I have no certain means of judging of the letter, and I entreat you will tell me all you have heard. That is certainly will, but it is very imperfect and unsatisfactory information. I gather it by accident from an Italian who was speaking to another person of his monotony. They were talking of his marriage. The Italian said that if he was the person he meant, he was not likely to make Madame Sharon happy. He proceeded to speak of him in general terms of dislike, and then gave some particular hints concerning his character that excited my curiosity, and I went to ask him a few questions. He was reserved in his replies, but after hesitating for some time he owned that he had understood abroad that Montoni was a man of desperate fortune and character. He said something of a castle of Montoni's situated among the Apennines, and of some strange circumstances that might be mentioned as to his former mode of life. I pressed him to inform me further, but I believe the strong interest I felt was visible in my manner, and alarmed him, for no entreaties could prevail with him to give my explanation of the circumstances he had alluded to, or to mention anything further concerning Montoni. I observed to him that if Montoni was possessed of a castle in the Apennines, it appeared from such circumstances that he was of some family, and also seemed to contradict the report, and he was a man of entirely broken fortune. He shook his head and looked as if he could have said a great deal, but made no reply. A hope of learning something more satisfactory or more positive detained me in his company a considerable time, and I renewed the subject repeatedly, but the Italian wrapped himself up in reserve, and that what he had mentioned he had caught only from a floating report, and that reports frequently arose from personal malice and was very little to be dependent upon. I forbore to praise the subject further, since it was obvious that he was alarmed for the consequence of what he had already said, and I was compelled to remain in uncertainty on a point where suspense is almost intolerable. Think, Emily, what I must suffer to see you depart for a foreign country, committed to the power of a man of such doubtful character as is this Montoni. But I will not alarm you unnecessarily. It is possible, as the Italian said at first, that this is not the Montoni he alluded to. Yet Emily considered well before you resolved to commit yourself to him. Valancourt walked upon the terrace with hurried steps, with Emily remained leaning on the balustrade in deep thought. The information she had just received excited, perhaps more alarm than it could justify, and raised once more the conflict of its sullen watchfulness, as occasion, and even slight occasion, had called forth the latent soul she had often observed with emotion, while from the usual expression of his countenance she had always shrunk. From such observations she was the more inclined to believe that it was this Montoni of whom the Italian had uttered his suspicious hints. The thought of being solely in his power in a foreign land was terrifying to her, but it was not by terror alone that she was urged to an immediate marriage with Valancourt. The tenderest love had already pleaded his cause, but had been unable to overcome her opinion as to her duty, her disinterested consideration for Valancourt, and the delicacy which made her revolt from a clandestine union. It was not to be expected that a vague terror would be more powerful than the united influence of love and grief, but it recalled all her energy and rendered a second conquest necessary. With Valancourt, whose imagination was now awake to the suggestion of every passion, whose apprehensions for Emily had acquired strength by the mere mention of them, and become very instant more powerful as his mind brooded over them. With Valancourt no second conquest was attainable. He thought he saw in the clearest light, and love assisted the fear, that this journey to Italy would involve Emily in misery. He determined therefore to persevere in opposing it and in conjuring her to bestow upon him the title of her lawful protector. Emily, said he, with solemn honesty, this is no time for sculptural distinction, for weighing the dubious and comparatively trifling circumstances that may affect our future comfort. I now see much more clearly than before the train of serious dangers you are going to encounter with a man of Montoni's character. Those dark hints of the Italian spoke much, but not more than the idea I have of Montoni's disposition, as exhibited even in his countenance. I think I see at this moment all that could have been hinted, written there. He is the Italian whom I fear, and I conjure you, for your own sake as well as for mine, to prevent the evils I shudder to foresee. O Emily, let my tenderness, my arms, withhold you from them. Give me the right to defend you. Emily only shied, while Valancourt proceeded to remonstrate and to retreat with all the energy that love and apprehension could inspire. But as his imagination magnified to her the possible evils she was going to meet, the mists of her own fancy began to dissipate, and allowed her to distinguish the exaggerated images which imposed on his reason. She considered that there was no proof of Montoni being the person whom the stranger had meant, that even if he was so, the Italian had noticed his character and broken fortunes merely from report, and that, though the countenance of Montoni seemed to give probability to a part of the rumour, it was not by such circumstances that an implicit belief of it could be justified. This consideration would probably not have arisen so distinctly to her mind at this time, had not the terrors of Valancourt presented to her such obvious exaggeration of her danger as incited her to distrust the fallacies of passion. His voice and countenance changed to an expression of dark despair. Emily, said he, this moment is the bitterest that is yet come to me. You cannot love me. It would be impossible for you to reason thus coldly, thus deliberately. If you did, I am torn with anguish at the prospect of our separation and of the evils that may await you in consequence of it. I would encounter any hazards to prevent it, to save you. No, Emily, no, you cannot love me. The last words fluttered on her lips, and her tears flowed forth. These words and tears brought once more, and with instantaneous force, conviction of her love to Valancourt. He could only exclaim, Emily, Emily, and weep over the hand he pressed to his lips. But she, after some moments, again roused herself from the indulgence of sorrow, and said, I must leave you. It is late, and my absence from the chateau may be discovered. Think of me, love me. When I am far away, the belief of this will be my comfort. Think of you, love you, exclaimed Valancourt. Try to moderate this transport, said Emily. For my sake, try. For your sake? Yes, for my sake, replied Emily. I cannot leave you thus. Then do not leave me, said Valancourt with quickness. Why should we part, or part for longer than till tomorrow? Indeed I am, unequal to these moments, replied Emily. You tear my heart, but I never can consent to this hasty, imprudent proposal. If we could command our time, my Emily, it should not be thus hasty. We must submit to circumstances. We must indeed. I have already told you all my heart, my spirits are gone. You allowed the force of my objection till your tenderness called our vague terrors, which have given us both unnecessary anguish. Spare me, do not oblige me to repeat the reasons I have already urged. Spare you, cried Valancourt. I am a wretch, a very wretch, that have felt only for myself. I, who ought to have shown the fortitude of a man, who ought to have supported you, I have increased your sufferings by the conduct of a child. Forgive me, Emily. Think of the distraction of my mind now that I am about to part with all that is dear to me, and forgive me. When you are gone, I shall recollect with bitter remorse that I have made you suffer. and shall wish in vain that I could see you, if only for a moment, that I might soothe your grief. Tears again interrupted his voice, and Emily wept with him. I will show myself more worthy of your love, said Valancourt at length. I will not prolong these moments, my Emily. Oh, my Emily, never forget me. God knows when we shall meet again. I resign you to his care. Oh God, protect and bless her. He pressed her hand to his heart. Emily sunk almost lifeless on his bosom, and neither wept nor spoke. Valancourt, now commending his own distress, tried to comfort and reassure her, but she appeared totally unaffected by what she said, and a sigh which she uttered now and then was all that proved she had not fainted. He supported her slowly towards the shadow, weeping and speaking to her, but she answered only in sighs, till, having reached the gate that terminated the avenue, she seemed to have recovered her consciousness, and looking around perceived how near they were to the shadow. We must part here, said she, stopping. Why prolong these moments? Teach me the fortitude I have forgot. Valancourt struggled to assume a composed air. Farewell, my love, said he, in a voice of solemn tenderness. Trust me, we shall meet again, meet for each other, meet to part no more. His voice faltered, but recovering it, he proceeded in a former tone. You know not what I shall suffer till I hear from you. I shall omit no opportunity of conveying to you my letters, yet I tremble to think how few may occur. And trust me, love, for your dear sake, I will try to bear this absence with fortitude. Oh, how little I have shown tonight. Farewell, said Emily faintly. When you are gone, I shall think of many things I would have said to you, and I of many, said Valancourt. I never left you yet, that I didn't immediately remember some question or some entreaty or some circumstance concerning my love that I earnestly wished to mention, and feel wretched because I couldn't. Oh, Emily, this countenance on which now I gaze will in a moment be gone from my eyes, and not all the efforts of fancy will be able to recall it with exactness. Oh, what an infinite difference between this moment and the next! Now I am in your presence, can behold you, then all will be a dreary blank, and I shall be a wanderer exiled from my only home. Valancourt again pressed her in his heart, and held her there in silence. Weeping tears once again calmed her oppressed mind. They again bade each other farewell, lingered a moment, and then parted. Valancourt seemed to force himself from the spot. He passed hastily up the avenue, and Emily, as she moved slowly towards the chateau, heard his distant step. He listened to the sounds as they sunk fainter and fainter, till the melancholy stillness of night alone remained, and then hurried to her chamber to seek repose, which, alas, was fled from her wretchedness.